The deck creaks beneath the bare feet of men who haven't seen land for 37 days. The Caravel rocks in waters that no European map has ever accurately described. It is 1475, and this Portuguese ship sails through a stretch of the Atlantic where the distance between ports can mean the death of half the crew. In the hold, between barrels of water that are beginning to smell and infested biscuit tins, 23 men share a space smaller than a typical house. They sail because they were recruited, because they fled justice, because they believed in promises of fortune, or simply because they had no other choice. Above, the pilot follows stars he has learned to recognize through nights of obsessive observation. Beside him, a bronze astrolabe oscillates with the movement of the waves. The reading is never exact, and the error can be leagues. And leagues in this ocean are the difference between finding the African coast or disappearing in unknown currents. On board, the hierarchy is brutal and clear. The captain commands with absolute authority, backed by the crown and by fear. Below him, the pilot bears the responsibility of navigation. Further down, ordinary sailors perform repetitive and exhausting tasks, adjusting sails, checking rigging, pumping water from the bilge, keeping the ship functional against salt corrosion. There is no real rest. Shifts alternate in irregular cycles. Sleeping means lying on wet mats, surrounded by the smell of dirty bodies and the constant sound of wood creaking against the sea. Food follows a logic of managed scarcity. Hard biscuits, salted meat that needs to be soaked, dried fish, onions when there are any left, and sour wine that replaces water when the barrels rot. Rats compete for the same food. Aboard an Atlantic caravel, hunger is not an occasional crisis. It is a structural condition of the voyage. But then, between 1415 and 1498, something fundamental changes in the relationship between Europe and the ocean. Portugal, a peripheral kingdom without direct access to the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean, transforms the Atlantic into a highway. And this transformation doesn't happen in palaces or council chambers. It happens inside fragile ships, crewed by men who risk their lives to convert fear into a trade route. This episode shows what it was like to live within that system. How Portuguese sailors navigated uncharted waters with imperfect technology, violent discipline, and motivations that mixed ambition, desperation, and coercion. How the Atlantic expansion before becoming an empire was an endless series of brutal voyages where most of the men on board had little chance of returning unscathed. And how this brutal process built the networks that would connect continents and reshape global history. The Caravel is the central artifact of this transformation. Developed over decades of Portuguese naval experimentation, it combines elements of Mediterranean and Atlantic traditions. It has triangular lateen sails that allow it to sail against the wind, an essential characteristic for returning from the African coast against the trade winds. Its hull is relatively narrow, allowing for speed and maneuverability. But it is also a tiny space for long ocean voyages. A typical caravel measures between 20 and 25 meters in length. Inside, our crews of 20 to 30 men live together in conditions that defy any modern concept of habitability. There are no individual berths. There is no privacy. There is no separation between work, eating, and resting spaces. The ship is simultaneously a navigation tool, a warehouse, a fortress, and a floating prison. Navigation itself is an exercise in imperfect calculation and constant observation. The pilot uses instruments that measure latitude with a considerable margin of error. The nautical astrolabe allows one to estimate the height of the sun or known stars in relation to the horizon. But the ship's movement, the imprecision of the instruments, and the difficulty of accurate readings under adverse conditions make each measurement an approximation. Longitude remains a practical mystery. Portuguese pilots developed dead reckoning navigation techniques, calculating distance traveled based on estimated speed and elapsed time. They relied on observations of currents, watercolor, the presence of seabirds, and types of algae. Each element is a clue. Each clue can be misleading. A miscalculation can lead the ship far from the planned coast, and far from the coast, supplies run out. Then comes the reality of scarcity. Drinking water becomes the most critical resource. Stored in wooden barrels, it rots in a few days under the heat of the deck. Crews learn to ration green, bitter-tasting water that causes intestinal illnesses. When the water runs out completely, men drink sour wine or try to collect rainwater in outstretched sails. Food follows the same logic of progressive degradation. Naval biscuit, made from pressed flour and cooked until it becomes rock hard, is the basis of the diet. Over time, it becomes infested with weevils. Sailors learn to beat the biscuit on the deck before eating it to drive away the insects. Salted meat becomes rancid. Dried fish develops mold. What begins as planned provision becomes a test of biological endurance. Scurvy, caused by the absence of vitamin C in diets without fresh vegetables, becomes endemic. Gums bleed, teeth fall out, old wounds reopen, men waste away. There is no cure on board, only waiting. Discipline is maintained through institutionalized violence. Captains have the authority to punish insubordination, theft of provisions, desertion, or any behavior that threatens the order of the ship. Public floggings on deck are common. Serious disobedience can result in summary execution, but especially on the high seas where there is no higher authority to appeal to. Sailors know that questioning orders can mean death. This structure of absolute power is not gratuitous cruelty. It is the mechanism that keeps ships functioning in conditions where the collapse of hierarchy would mean the collapse of the voyage. But it is also a system that normalizes brutality and transforms men into replaceable parts of a larger machine. Parallel to the violence of discipline runs the violence of labor. Adjusting sails in Atlantic storms means climbing swaying rigging while winds try to tear men from the mast. Falling overboard during a night storm means disappearing without ceremony. Keeping the ship afloat demands continuous physical strength, pumping water leaking into the hold, repairing torn sails, mending rigging worn down by salt, reinforcing wooden structures creaking under the pressure of the waves. Each task is performed with simple tools and brute force. There is no sophisticated machinery. There is no labor protection. There is only the immediate need to keep the ship sailing, and the awareness that stopping means dying. In the midst of this brutal routine, a micro-society with its own codes develops. Sailors share superstitions that attempt to bring order to the chaos of the ocean. Certain rituals are followed before setting sail. Certain saints are invoked during storms. Playing dice and telling stories become ways to resist the monotony. Small personal objects, amulets, family letters, religious medals, become emotional anchors in an environment where individual identity is constantly threatened by the uniformity of routine and forced proximity. There is also an informal economy. Sailors trade objects, gamble, and exchange favors. Within the narrow confines of the ship, alliances and enmities emerge that structure daily life as much as the official hierarchy. And here, a fundamental paradox arises. At first glance, these voyages seem like adventures of discovery. But in reality, they are calculated commercial operations where sailors are disposable resources. Portugal doesn't send caravels to the Atlantic out of scientific curiosity. It sends them because it needs to circumvent commercial monopolies that control European access to Asian spices and African gold. Each voyage is an investment, and like any investment under high-risk conditions, it accepts high loss rates. Crews die, ships sink. But the routes become established, because even with losses, the economic return justifies the continuity of the system. Sailors who survive return with minimal pay and destroyed bodies. Captains and financiers return with profits that finance new expeditions. This structural asymmetry is the engine of Atlantic expansion, From there, the system expands geographically and deepens institutionally. In 1422, Portuguese navigators reach Cape Bojador on the African coast, considered for decades an insurmountable psychological limit. In 1444, they arrive in the Senegambia region. In 1488, Bartolomeo Dias rounds the Cape of Good Hope, opening the way to the Indian Ocean. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completes the sea route to India. Each geographical milestone represents hundreds of previous voyages that tested techniques, mapped winds, identified currents, and lost crews. Portuguese maritime knowledge accumulates through systematic failure and brutal learning. This accumulation of knowledge is not merely technical, it is also violent and extractive from the outset. Portuguese navigators did not find empty coasts. They encountered complex African societies with their own economies, political structures, and trade networks. And quickly, contact transformed into exploitation. Gold, ivory, and progressively, enslaved people became the central commodities of the Atlantic trade. Aboard the returning ships traveled not only exhausted Portuguese crews. Captured or purchased Africans traveled, locked in even more cramped holds, beginning the route that would become the transatlantic slave trade. Life aboard, already brutal for European sailors, became hell for enslaved Africans, treated as living, our disposable cargo. Ports like Lagos and Lisbon become distribution centers for this Atlantic economy. Goods are unloaded at the docks, crews disperse. Some sailors die days after returning, victims of diseases contracted during the voyage. Others quickly spend their pay and re-enlist because the land-based economy offers no alternatives. Young men are recruited with promises of wealth. Criminals are forced to embark as an alternative to prison. The system feeds on a constant turnover of cheap and disposable labor. And it works because there are always more men willing or forced to risk their lives at sea. Naval technology advances through this process. Caravels are complemented by carracks, larger and more robust ships capable of carrying more cargo and heavy artillery. Sailing systems become more sophisticated. Shipbuilding techniques incorporate decades of learning. Navigational instruments improve marginally. But the core of the maritime experience remains brutally similar. Ships continue to be confined, unhealthy, and dangerous spaces. Voyages continue to kill men through disease, malnutrition, accidents, and violence. Technical progress reduces risks, but does not eliminate them. And it does not fundamentally alter the asymmetry between those who profit and those who die. Within this system, a Portuguese maritime identity emerges that blends pride, trauma, and pragmatism. Experienced pilots become valuable figures, bearers of knowledge that cannot be found in books. Sailors who survive multiple voyages develop specialized skills and status within the informal hierarchy. Successful captains accumulate prestige and privileges. But this restricted meritocracy coexists with the massive mortality of ordinary men. Most of those who embark do not become heroes nor accumulate wealth. They simply work, suffer, and often die on routes that others have already established. The ocean thus becomes a workspace, not a place for romantic adventure, a hostile environment that must be crossed repeatedly for goods to circulate and profits to accumulate. Sailors do not explore out of curiosity. They sail because it is work. Poorly paid work, extremely dangerous, socially devalued, but essential work for the construction of commercial networks that will transform the world economy. Portuguese expansion in the Atlantic is not the product of exceptional genius or superhuman courage. It is the product of a system that organizes violence, scarcity, and risk into productive cycles. This logic is reproduced in other European maritime contexts. Spaniards crossed the Western Atlantic in Columbus's footsteps. The English, Dutch, and French established their own routes. Each maritime power replicates variations of the same model. Fragile ships, disposable crews, brutal discipline, commercial objectives, territorial expansion. The Atlantic becomes a space of imperial competition, and the men aboard the ships, regardless of the flag, experience similar versions of structural suffering. On the African coast, Portuguese trading posts became fixed points of commerce, small fortifications where Europeans negotiated with African intermediaries, where goods were stored before shipment, where sick crews tried to recover before returning. These posts were simultaneously commercial centers, military bases, and prisons, are guarded by small garrisons living in hostile isolation, surrounded by climates that Europeans were not adapted to face. Malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases regularly killed soldiers and merchants. The African coast became a graveyard for many who remained there, but the trading posts persisted because they were necessary for the continuity of trade. Meanwhile, aboard the ships, the experience of time is transformed. Weeks become indistinguishable. Days are marked only by the work cycle, meager meals, and watch shifts. Sailors lose track of exact dates. The calendar matters less than observing signs: changing winds, water temperature, type of fish, presence of birds. These natural indicators replace chronometers and calendars as tools for temporal orientation. Life aboard develops its own rhythm, dictated by the ship's needs and the whims of the ocean. Personal birthdays, religious holidays, and civic dates lose relevance in the face of the immediate urgency of keeping the ship sailing. Religious fervor intensifies in this context. Makeshift chapels on ship's house images of saints. Collective prayers are held daily, especially during crises. Storms provoke desperate promises. Survival is interpreted as a miracle. Death is accepted as divine will. This religiosity is not merely spiritual consolation, it is also a mechanism of social control. Religious rituals reinforce hierarchy, mark the passage of time, and offer a narrative of meaning for seemingly random suffering. Priests or chaplains on board, when present, function as extensions of the captain's authority. They preach obedience, resignation, and hope for heavenly reward for earthly suffering. But not all voyages end in return. Shipwrecks are common. Atlantic storms destroy ships. Uncharted reefs shatter hulls. Fires on board spread rapidly through tar-soaked wooden structures. When a ship sinks, few survive. There are not enough lifeboats. There are no efficient rescue techniques. Sailors who fall overboard in the open sea simply disappear. Others die trapped in waterlogged holds. Some reach deserted beaches, where they die of hunger or thirst. Remains of shipwrecks are discovered decades later. Skeletal remains on remote beaches. Wooden wrecks identified by Portuguese crown markings. Silent witnesses of voyages that never completed their route. Even for those who return, readjusting to life on land is difficult. Men who have spent months on ships develop difficulty walking on land. They feel the ground shake for weeks. They suffer from chronic malnutrition and permanent physical damage. Many never fully recover. Others return psychologically transformed. They have nightmares about storms. They react violently to enclosed spaces. They develop alcohol dependence as a way to escape memories. 15th century Portuguese society lacked concepts of psychological trauma or support systems for veterans. Sailors dealt with the after effects alone or in informal communities of others who shared similar experiences. Children and teenagers are also part of these crews. Cabin boys, aged between 10 and 15, are taken aboard to perform basic tasks, carrying objects, cleaning decks, assisting with rigging. They learn navigation through direct and brutal experience. Many die young. Those who survive grow up quickly, forged by conditions that destroy any notion of a protected childhood. Their lives are living records of how historical societies exploited child labor without moral hesitation, and of how economic systems structure violence in ways that span generations. The economics of the voyage also creates tensions between crew and command. Captains and officers often have a share in the expedition's profits. Ordinary sailors receive fixed salaries when they receive any at all. This difference creates structural resentment. In extreme situations, mutinies break out. Mutinous crews seize control of ships, assassinate captains, and divert routes. The Portuguese crown responds with violent repression. Mutiny leaders are publicly executed. But mutinies continue to occur because the conditions that provoke them remain unchanged. The tension between absolute authority and human despair is constant on board. Simultaneously, a maritime culture of oral narratives emerges. Sailors tell stories of past voyages. They exaggerate the dangers they faced. They invent sea monsters. They describe mysterious islands. These narratives spread through taverns in Lisbon, Lagos, and Porto. They fuel the popular imagination about the ocean. Some become legends that persist for centuries. Others are incorporated into maps as real geographical information. The boundary between real observation and collective fantasy becomes blurred, and this blurring shapes how Europeans understand the world beyond their shores. Between 1415 and 1498, these voyages transformed Portugal from a peripheral kingdom into a maritime power. But this transformation was built upon thousands of anonymous deaths, upon the bodies of sailors consumed by scurvy at sea, upon enslaved Africans who would never return to their lands, upon families who never knew the fate of sons and husbands who disappeared at sea. The Portuguese maritime empire did not emerge from a vacuum. It arose from the systematic accumulation of organized suffering. Technically, Portuguese navigators learned to use trade winds and Atlantic currents in a predictable way. They developed the so-called volta do mar, return by sea, a navigation technique that allowed them to return from the African coast by first sailing west, away from the coast, to catch favorable winds before turning northeast towards Portugal. This technique required navigating through unknown waters, far from any visual reference, relying only on imperfect astronomical calculations. It required courage, but also a structural desperation that made men willing to risk their lives in nautical experiments. Instruments like the cross-staff and quadrant complement the astrolabe, allowing latitude measurements using different methods. Pilots compare results from different instruments to reduce the margin of error. They develop solar declination tables that help calculate position based on the sun's height at different times of the year. This technical knowledge is carefully guarded. Portugal tries to keep navigation routes and techniques secret. Experienced pilots are forbidden from serving other nations. Detailed maps are treated as state secrets. But information leaks. Naval industrial espionage is common, and progressively, other European powers acquire similar maritime knowledge. Economically, Portuguese Atlantic trade was structured around trading posts, royal monopolies, and commercial licenses. The Crown controlled key aspects of trade, taxing goods, licensing voyages, and monopolizing certain routes. Private merchants operated under this system, financing expeditions in exchange for a share of the profits. The model was highly centralized and protectionist, functioning to concentrate wealth in the hands of a mercantile elite and nobility connected to the crown. Sailors who performed royal work remained on the margins of this wealth. By the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese Atlantic system was consolidated. Routes were known, trading posts were established, and navigation techniques were passed down from generation to generation of pilots, and the model of violent commercial exploitation was normalized. What began as hesitant attempts to sail beyond Cape Bojador had transformed into a commercial network connecting Europe, Africa, and soon Asia and America. The ocean ceased to be a barrier and became a highway. But this transformation cost countless lives, and it established patterns of colonial violence that would persist for centuries. Life aboard Portuguese Atlantic caravels was no romantic adventure. It was brutal labor under extreme conditions. It was hunger, disease, violence, and fear managed as necessary costs of an emerging economic system. It was the daily reality of men who built empires without living to enjoy them. And it was the laboratory where Europe learned to transform oceans into instruments of global power. What has changed is the geography of world trade. What has remained is the brutal asymmetry between those who risk their lives and those who reap the profits. And the structural compromise that has emerged is this: global connectivity built on systematic exploitation, where technical progress and territorial expansion go hand in hand with normalized violence and disposable suffering. If you want to understand how the modern world became connected, you need to start here, on the creaking wooden decks beneath the Atlantic, in the holds where men shared space with rats and stagnant water, in the daily decisions of pilots navigating stars in oceans that were still unnamed on their maps. Because globalization didn't begin in boardrooms. It began on fragile ships crewed by disposable men who transformed the fear of the unknown into a trade route.